Kia ora koto katoa. Thank you so much for joining us on this session on decolonizing organizing processes. And once again, we have a fantastic panel with us. We have Dr. Ban, we have Professor Debashish Munshi, Dr. Mary Simpson, we have Dr. Rahul Rastogi, and Dr. Dazzelyn Zapata. So an amazing panel, and it's a particular delight to have with you Debashish, who has set many of these conversations on decolonizing organizing and led us onto this path. So really privileged to have you here. So the first prompt for this session asks, what are the key registers for decolonizing the scholarship of organizing? And we will start with you, Zhou.
Thank you. This is really an awesome question, because this is also a question that I constantly ask myself as I was conducting field work, studying organizations, both setting in the US and also in different parts of the world. And very often decolonization is a good word to describe this, but in practice as a scholar, I think about questions like what is the politics of representation? How do I think about politics, especially the racial politics of this in today's day and world, and with the global kind of political environment? How do I think take into account the kind of xenophobia and sometimes almost like a Cold War kind of environment where we see the antagonistic kind of structure and sentiment emerging from first of all the political arena, but inevitably bleeding into the scholarship and the academic circles. Of course, if I'm the first person to respond to this, and a good way to start that is to try to chart the waters and see what are the categories that I'm thinking about. And my habit of thinking, I would always go like a little bit of categories, and I would think of the ideological level or the broader societal level, the institutional level of and then looking at the specific studies and campaigns, so on and so forth. And for my personally, in my recent study, I start to focus more and more on the idea of institutionalize issues that takes place at the institutional level, meaning that at the same time we're looking at the broader social structural kind of element of knowledge creation process, or we can look at the specific instances of studies and the individuals who are taking part in the studies. But I find really, for me, I'm more interested at what's happening at the institutional level, meaning what happens when groups of people, groups of scholars in their research start to, in a sense, the organizing of the study of organizations and of organizings. And I find that to be especially useful for scholars who are interested in discourse, because that somehow helps me to answer the question of discursive muscles, of discursive teeth. Meaning that at the very individual level, sometimes I look at the discourse of colonization, but I do not see how that translating into broader social transformations, or at the broader social level. When I look at discourses, sometimes I find it difficult to connect, to make like a scholarly connection with a social, between a social discourse to what's happening in the broader social processes. But I find it interesting at the institutional level, by which I mean, how do scholarship organize? How do research projects organize? What happens at funding, to organize a research project from the funding stage to the stage of publication, and the organization, the tenure process, universities and research institutes as institutions. I can give a couple of examples to show why institutions of funding is relevant to the idea of decolonizing scholarship. I've been just today, I've been reading a new an article that talks about how the funding sources that's located in the West fundamentally kind of structures a research project with the West at the center, where the scholars who are contributing in the third world country, just because of the funding, the location of the funding and the distribution of the funding, will inevitably be the person who is contacted the last, who are pushed to the peripheral of the research projects. I'm interested in looking at publication as an institution, how that is organized. Where are publications, the headquarters of publications located, how publications are used in institutions, in scholarly institutions as criteria for tenure and promotion, and how that when I was in a conference in China, oh gosh, that's 2 years ago. I was trying to invite local scholars who are also interested in labor organizing to participate in my research or share research. And a lot of them were saying that their research is largely hindered by where the publication outlets are located. In a sense, I asked them, why don't you publish more Chinese language articles when your research subjects, also your main audiences, are in China and speak Chinese? They told me that not only are the key recognized flagship journals in English and headquartered or like edited by scholars that's located in a different country, but also in their local institutions, tenure and promotion is linked to their publication in these outlets that are located overseas. So besides that, I also want to talk about the issue of language as an author, and also as a reviewer. I don't know how many times that I have been commented on, you should work on your on the the APA issues or copy editing issues. Find copy editing kind of assistance, like English assistance for your publication. I myself, as a reviewer, has put down that too. And just recently, I've been thinking about how the implication of language in institutions of education and its impact on the kind of scholars and kind of scholarship that result from such institutions. I've been joking with some of my also like friends who reviews and edit, and who also like Chinese scholar friends, talking about how when you are speaking, your accent is recognized, but when you're writing, somehow you have to write in certain language that exactly pinpoint where you are as a scholar on a global map. I don't know how I'm working on the time here, but I think I want to summarize that I feel what I personally feel is an entry point of looking at decolonizing scholarship is to look at the institutional level, and specifically looking at the institutional funding and its impact on the organization of research teams, to look at publications as an institution, especially looking at how language works in the publication processes. Thank you.
I think was quite new. But to cut a long story short, what I'm trying to say here is that for me, meaningful research is always, I'm always mindful of the fact that I am unabashedly a subjective researcher. And I know many researchers, react to that, and especially when they couch their own subjectivity under a veneer of objectivity. But one of the questions that I've always tried to raise is that what is objective? Is there such a thing as an objectivity? Because yes, you can have statistical data from surveys and simulations, very useful, very, very useful, as are qualitative data from interviews and observations. But ultimately, who the respondents are, who the interviewees are, who the interviewer is, who the analyst is, can make a difference to the results obtained and the conclusions drawn. And right through, I've kept that at the back of my mind. So I don't pretend to be an objective researcher. When I go into a project, I say, this is where I come from. These are my views. And so whatever I'm seeing, it's not as if I'm trying to manipulate the data, but whatever I see is through my lens, and I'm transparent about that. I mean, so yes, somebody else can see the same data from another point of view. So, so the question here is that right from the beginning, and Zhou said that you need to take it at the institutional level, and I think she's right, because the scholarship of organizing seems to follow the dominant logics of organizational processes itself. And so that's what it is. So I think so when we come from a critical perspective, and when I use a critical methodological approach, I'm trying to critique the organizational processes themselves. And so when I say I'm a subjective researcher, one of the things is that in an article some time ago, I had actually asked that what is it about subjectivity that frightens the institutional academic? I mean, could it be that subjectivity challenges the very basis of organizational control? Could it be that it threatens the way we do things here, organizational culture? Could it be that it shakes research from its lofty, exclusive perch high above the real world and forces it to confront life? I mean, is that what it is? So one thing I'd like to make clear here is that subjectivity is not about doing whatever you want or writing whatever you want. That's not the point here. Methodological integrity is indeed paramount, but it's subjectivity that contextualizes research, and that's where I come from. And paying attention to context, as I see it, is a major part of decolonizing organizational processes. And this includes questioning the legitimacy of organizational theorizing and resisting the sites of control manifested in entrenched worldviews, perspectives, and decisions that have traditionally deemed to be naturally objective. So this so-called objectivity, as Frantz Fanon actually said many, many years ago, has historically gone against the interests of colonized people. So to address your question, Mohan, I would say that decolonizing organizational processes requires challenging assumptions about so-called objectivity. Now, let me give you an example, a contemporary example of the organizational responses of states and institutions to the cause of Palestine. If looking at the Palestinians' cry for freedom as a conflict between Israel and Palestine and a desire to acknowledge both sides of the story is objective, then objectivity, whatever that means, is merely an instrument of colonization. That's because such objectivity places both sides on an imagined level playing field, although one side is the colonizer and the other is colonized. One side is a nuclear-armed, US-backed, militarized, land-occupying Israeli state, and on the other side is a largely defenseless and disenfranchised body of Palestinian people seeking their sovereign right to return to their own homes. Look at the calls, the organization processes of diplomacy, for instance, the bureaucratic adherence to faux objectivity that calls for peace and expresses a commitment to the two-state solution, but fails to carry out any meaningful action of any of them. So far from facilitating Palestinian freedom or even the sanctity of two states, these diplomatic processes only serve to reinforce the status quo of a single colonizing state that not only openly wields absolute occupying power, but isolates, oppresses, and incarcerates Palestinians on their own land. So this is just one example of, and if you look at all the countries that we are part of, they all take these diplomatic positions. You know, we want peace and we want two-state solution. I mean, even the two-state solution, even if you're committed to it, how come you recognize only one of them? I mean, so what is it? So there's something about these organizing processes that kind of, entrench some of these dominant perspectives. And the scholarship, as I'm saying, tends to mirror those. And so that's why, the two are linked. So decolonizing organization processes calls for resisting the structures of domination. And these are things that many scholars, such as Fanon, for instance, have said for a very long time. But rather than sitting back and accepting processes that seemingly speak for all but favor a few, and I might add an elite few, decolonization involves active and sometimes even insurgent resistance. Democracy is certainly an ideal value, but when organizations and institutions invoke democracy to design processes that impose the tyranny of the majority onto hapless minorities, it becomes a colonizing tool that needs to be resisted. Now, if institutions in, let's say, Modi and Shah's India, for example, get away with minority bashing processes in the name of a so-called democratic mandate, they need to be actively resisted. The actions demonstrate a profound ignorance of what democracy actually entails, including a recognition of the rights of all and the importance of both processes and outcome, among other things. So as I see it, organizational processes can be decolonized only when taken for granted ideas, notions, values, and ways of doing things are actively dismantled and rebuilt with fresh ideas based on equity and justice. A framework of alternative organizing that is decolonizing, among other things, fights globalized capitalism and the resulting growing inequalities, reinvigorates democracy and the public sphere, supports a variety of identities and differences, confronts the global environmental crisis, and forges connections based on solidarity and translocalism. In my own work carried out with my colleague Kirsten Broadfoot, we've outlined three central conceptual post-colonial commitments, and I know I'll come back to the word post-colonial at some stage, to disrupt and reimagine organizing spaces, resist colonialist discourse, and rethink organizing practices, and decolonize thought and reconfigure organizing forms of knowledge. Now, each commitment entails both deconstructive and imaginative impulses. Disrupting and imagining organizing spaces requires scholars to take seriously how cultural, national, and international organizing practices and forms are located, as our colleagues Raka Shom and Radha Hegde have said, in the larger unequal histories and geographies of global power and culture. It also means moving from representing others to collaborating with others in shared spaces, and I might add, with mutual respect. Rethinking organizing practices calls for interrogating how seemingly neutral organizing practices normalize, in effect, Euro-American political values as universal, and paying more attention to other ways of thinking, especially drawing inspiration from indigenous epistemologies. Linked to these commitments is the goal of decolonizing thought and reconfiguring forms of knowledge. Several scholars in our own discipline of communication studies are living up to this commitment through their work. I mean, Mohan's work on communicating for social change that resists power structures in oppressive neoliberal global context is one very, very good example of this. And personally, I have been fortunate in working with Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, author of the path-breaking decolonizing methodologies, to draw on the indigenous research framework of Kaupapa Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I'm based, to formulate a process of decolonizing communication ethics. Some of my more recent work have been with Maori researchers in decolonizing organizational processes in the science and technology realm in Aotearoa, but more on that later. I hope I haven't digressed too much from the central question. Back to you, Mohan.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Debashish. There's a lot to reflect on from there. I'm not going to take the time to summarize, but rather perhaps move on to Rahul to articulate your thoughts.
Sure. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, great. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Mohan, for inviting me to this panel, and thank you, everyone, for being here and sharing this time, space, and energy, because this is a very fascinating conversation, and I'm sure it's going to get more and more intriguing as it progresses, because already I'm the third panelist, and I'm registering that we are looking at organizing as a process in very different ways. And that's very evocative of this question and the relevance of what we are trying to do here. So without going that way, let me just qualify, or let me just preface my responses with the fact that I work with farmer populations in rural Bundelkhand in central India, and I focus on things like water sustainability, farmer suicide, and so on and so forth, agrarian issues. And my my response is going to be in the context of field organizing processes, especially as they are relevant to rural India. So when I look at organizing, I'm choosing to reflect on that kind of organizing when I'm responding. So first of all, I want to kind of link what my response is to what Dr. Munshi was just saying, that when we have that the most fundamental act of decolonizing, study of organizing, would be to look at the taken for granted assumptions that actually entrench whiteness and colonizing and these processes in the larger systems of organizing. So in this part of my response, I want to look at one particular idea in this vein. So the first element of the register of whiteness or colonizing in terms of organizing and the study of organizing is the fact that most of the West-centric studies of organizing assumes or axiomatically understands that all organizing always has to be done under a banner where a dedicated purpose has been declared or an organization has been set up, and there are bodies marching under that, behind that banner, or there are people working in an organization like a corporation toward one particular mission or aim or objective, and that's how organizing works. Of course, this is a fiction, and anyone who has ever worked in any kind of organizing knows that this is fiction. But what I want to point out is that when we look at organizing processes, particularly what has emerged from my ethnological ethnographic work, is that on field, this idea is not present even as a fiction or even as an imagination. Like this idea that there has to be this common aim or objective or this common goal that all of us are working to because we are organizing. This idea itself is just completely absent. And we have to recognize this as part of our project of questioning some a priori truth, some unexamined truths. So if we recognize this, then how should we even imagine organizing, especially in these contexts of social change, particularly if focusing on indigenous peoples movements or other kinds of farmer movements, agrarian movements, women movements of the global South, and when can we say that organizing is happening? If we say that that this axiomatic idea of one one idea and everyone rallying behind it is absent, When do we look? When do we know that organization is happening? Now, this sort of lends us a very kind of a very different kind of a scholarly stance when we look at social movements. So when we look at movements that are organizing in solidarities, we don't approach that movement or the study of that movement is not done from the point of view of some sort of categorizing that this organizing is going to lead to X, Y, or Z, or this is good organizing and this is bad organizing, this is anti-capitalist organizing, this is pro-capitalist organizing, this organizing looks anti-capitalist, but it is actually very neoliberal, or this organizing it represents a class in itself, and this one represents a class for itself. All these kinds of categorizing imperatives perhaps need to be suspended. In this sense, studying organizing in the global South is fundamentally an asking endeavor. It is an endeavor where we try to look, try to understand, try to listen, to find out where and how organizing is happening. In place of a categorizing imperative, or one that jumps to understand the effectiveness, efficacy, impact of organizing, it has to be a more open question rather than a preset formula, which is being applied to whatever we see on the field. Consequently, in consequence to that, the position of the researcher also changes from someone who looks at the field from a preset lens to one who actually tries to derive this lens through engagement with the field, however contentious and difficult these processes would be. The process then, of course, again, as Professor Munshi was pointing out, it also always includes the researcher's own subjective positions, as well as that's also a part in the co-constructed in the co-construction of the study of organizing. And I'm really talking about deriving a lens to how we're going to look at organizing through engaging with the field. So what happens when one does that? What happens when one takes that kind of a stance? You start looking at the field to understand the what and the how of organizing, instead of creating a category around it or trying to fit it in some sort of taxonomy that already exists. And also, it also creates ideas in your research of the endemicness of your research, a kind of provisionality and contingency of such investigations, which are honest and fundamentally disruptive to the white registers of solid, stable, sterilized, standalone truths that people try to discover as maybe objective truths, or so on and so forth. We get to a very interesting question here. When do we categorize an organized event as an instance of organizing? So when do we know that organizing is happening? At the very, and this is my response and my claim here, at the very basic level, organizing is a coming together of people. So I argue, and I would want to study even traditional space events as where people come together as instances of organizing. If one does that, one can look at a lot of everyday eventful organizing that happens, especially in the rural terrain of India. For instance, in my research, I look at these seasonal festivals wherein people, especially women, come together to actually they assemble around a village temple, and part of the ritual is always to put every individual's seeds into a common granary and then take some seeds from the common granary to take home to add to their own individual seed collections. And this very effectively today very clearly looks like an organizing practice that ensures biodiversity, that ensures self-reliance, and so on and so forth. And we need to bring these kind of things under the aegis of organizing. Similarly, these everyday non-out of the ordinary kind of practices provide a significant, if I may call it, a significant public sphere inside rural India, where people come together and collectivize their sorrows. They make sense of their life situations. People share experiences to kind of collectively make sense of what's happening in their lives, and thus these spaces represent opportunities of activism and disruptions and so on and so forth. So since everyday organizing provides spaces for sharing experiences and establishes what in a very conventional or calm sense contributes to establishing a shared system of meaning, such instances cannot be excluded, but should be included included in our efforts to study organizing and organizational culture and organizations. Organizing here, and this is my last point, organizing here is to be understood as an autonomous act that community members can engage in, and not something that necessarily needs a larger a priori vision that has to be well chiseled and then people rally behind it, or not necessarily something that happens inside a formal system of an organization. Organizing can absolutely be conceptualized as a rather autonomous thing that emerges in our fieldworks and on different bases. And I'm going to stop here with this bit.
Kia ora, thank you, Rahul. Mary.
Tēnā koutou katoa e te whānau whānui, ko te arahatamanga, ko waiho me ohana muri na awa, ko ngā te Pākehā te iwi no ngā hoi whā aho. Pity we didn't have the Maori speakers in the room for that little bit, I'll explain. Ko Mary, so that's the toka wingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. I'm not quite sure which camera I'm looking at. It's all a bit weird. This one, here we are. Hello, camera. So thank you, Mohan, for inviting me to this session. And I feel like I actually know that I'm one of the non-Indigenous people in this room. I'm native to New Zealand, but I'm cultural Pākehā. And cultural Pākehā acknowledges the Indigenous peoples, the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I wanted to start with that, and the little mihi that I gave talked about where I live. And one of the great things I used was in the whā, and I am my history goes way back. I might be here in New Zealand, but I have heritage nearly all over the world. And in front of me, I have connections to the world that it is right now, meaning I have connections to the US, Canada, the US, Ireland, England, Germany, Scandinavia, Africa, the Creole in the US, and then I've got Sikh grandchildren, I've got Maori cousins, I've got Maori nieces and nephews. So the world for me is very diverse. So I came across the global south. I'm so naive when it comes to this. My scholarship is in organisational health, which really is about well-being. But I needed a route to get through from the concept of register, which I understand from a linguistic point of view or a musical point of view. But in the realm of organising, I really had to think about it. The other thing I needed to come to terms with was global south. I naively said to Debashish, does that mean is everything south of the equator, or is this some kind of ideological thing or a philosophical? I did some reading, thankfully. So the naive question is really important to ask. So what I went back to was this notion of register, and that it is, it's about not just the subject, tone and media of communication, but also within a given context and how we as speakers adjust our register to deal with, to be heard within a certain context or be seen. It's also about discursive. It's about the choices we make unconsciously and hopefully consciously between the micro discourse and the big discourses. When are we operating within them and when are we not? So that's for me. And also, who is speaking for whom, to whom, for what purpose and with what impact? And those are long questions for me way back in my own social work career from this illustrious university right here at Massey. I got my first degree here. So for me, the whole, how cognizant are we of the knowledge we carry around that we take for granted? That is also of the knowledge of others that we might bump into and not have a clue about. But because so many people in the world I work in think that this is the one world and this is the one view, where it's not. There are multiple and far more rich and less functionalist and far more spiritual and emotional and environmental ways of looking at the world that as organisers of research we need to be cognizant and connected to. So the global south, I discerned that for me it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor of, it's a philosophical context. It's a position within what I called a compass-informed location metaphor, where the magnetic north, which everybody is drawn to and thinks is normal, is at the centre, and where the south is marginal and peripheral and different, with the north being centre and normal. And please forgive me if that's really just too rough and raw, but I'm really trying to engage with this new perspective, this new idea. I just wanted to make sure I said something then. Oh yes, I'm going to get to it. So once I got to this point, I was able to negotiate and able to think, okay, where do I go from here? What is the space? The space I'm in, the location I'm in, is Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is geographically south, but it's so often in the dominant scheme of things, philosophically west. So, and I'm torn, and I'm culturally and politically Pākehā, which means I'm riding two worlds. At least two worlds, because of the work that I do. And even though I have this ethnic background, which is diverse as you could possibly, well, no, maybe not possibly be, but certainly ethnically diverse, I am riding this other tension, for want of a better word. And I feel totally overwhelmed by theory. I love theory. I love thinking about it. I love talking about it. But when I come to my talk about scholarship and organising research scholarship, I have to come back to the absolutely fundamentally practical. And it's within this broader, it's not just made up. It's not, what's that word, eclectic. It's not a cafeteria of ideas. It's located within a genuine want and desire to be connected to the place and people where I live. So my research is inherently personal, it's political, it's practical, and it's of place. So given my cultural political position, I thought I identified what I termed registers, or maybe they're too practical to be called registers, for decolonising the scholarship of organising within Aotearoa, New Zealand. The first one is kaupapa Māori. Kaupapa, which Debashish has already mentioned. This is Māori philosophy that incorporates knowledge, skills, practice, attitudes, values of Māori working towards tino rangatiratanga. That means self-directed, self-direction, self-determination. And it's more than research. And as a Pākehā, I can support kaupapa Māori, but I cannot enact or carry out kaupapa Māori research. So my backstop is community-based participatory research, which when I was first asked, did I know what it meant? I said yes, because I thought they were talking social work, because social work to me is about community development, and research is my way of developing community without doing it on my own. Absolutely not. But anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. So the other tenet to this decolonizing scholarship is Te Treaty of Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. And I use the three principles. The principles are partnership, participation, and protection. I'm going to talk about those a little bit later in terms of how they're carried out, but for now I'll just give them some definitions. These principles were originally developed from the 4 articles of the treaty that was signed in New Zealand in 1840. And the principles were originally intended to inform the relationship between the Crown and the government, and tangata whenua, or Maori. So, and those principles have been invoked as being able to be applied at the level of research. So that's what I do. I apply those from just about from day one when 2010, first one. So each principle is a lens for which to focus on different aspects of research, from determining what's in the field, determining what is the research in the first place, what is going to be the topic or the focus. And for me, research must be community driven. I am merely the attendant. So the principle of partnership implies relationships that support shared decision making, enabling Māori to exercise and drive the control and the responsibility, and working with Māori, hapu, iwi, and whānau and community. So that's partnership. The principle of participation is slightly different, but it concerns the involvement of Māori in planning and decision making, particularly in areas that will impact on them. So you can automatically see that in a research context, participation and partnership are tied together. You can't have one without the other, and they must be Māori driven. And the last one is the principle of protection, which in the Treaty of Waitangi referred to citizenship and equal rights, to the same rights and privileges as other New Zealanders. But significantly, it refers to the safeguarding of Māori cultural concepts, values, taonga, treasures, and for researchers, that means the appropriate consultation processes must be used. And again, it's about being invited into research. It's not to work with and for Māori, rather than do for or do to, I think is the better word. So those are the key things that I wanted to mention here. And I will get to some more practical examples of how the research that I do with our team, and I must say it's a team effort. I'm only here today because I'm lucky enough to be here, but there is a whole team behind me. They are community researchers, Māori community researchers, Māori Indigenous studies researchers, communication and health researchers. So we're all in this together, and I'm just the face today. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary. Kia ora. Dazzy.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we are in various time zones at the moment, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel and to be amongst all of these awesome scholars in the panel. Can you hear me okay? I think there's a feedback.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Mohan, and also, of course, to CARE for this wonderful opportunity. So I draw, to answer the first part on decolonizing, or key registers of decolonizing the scholarship of organizing, I'm drawing my experience, or I am drawing what I will share today with my almost 2 decades of work with indigenous communities in the Philippines, particularly the Kankanai and Bontoc Igorot of Mountain Province Philippines. So I come from, the Philippines is a country which has been colonized for a long time. We were colonized by Spain for 333 years and by the US for 48 years. But even to this day, you know, even with the absence of an actual colonizer in the Philippines, of course, the effect of it is deeply embedded in the minds of Filipinos. And this is very true in my experience working with, you know, not just in the communities, but also in the cities. And there are a lot of layers to this issue. And this foremost, the first is the issue of ethnicity. So in the Philippines, we don't talk about, it's not, the issue of colonizing doesn't really appear like as race. Say, for example, compared to the US or even in Singapore, where I am at the moment. So for us, it's the ethnicity, which is translated into languages. So you can, so when you do like indigenous community organizing, it's very difficult for somebody like me, for example, who is a Tagalog speaker, which is the dominant ethnicity in the Philippines. And this is for a good reason. Like indigenous communities, as they have faced, they have been ostracized for a long time, and even in popular culture in the Philippines, it persists. Like even if we have a lot of professionals, a lot of good politicians who are from indigenous background, this is always glossed over by this persisting mindset that when you're indigenous, you have this specific look. It's really very limiting for them, I would say. And this, you know, I just mentioned them. So there's always this us and them. And like for my work, I have always been the other, the one who others. Okay, so in the process of othering, and I find this like in this whole discussion of organizing, right? I mean, I can complain about it, but when you think about it, they come from a very valid position. So like even for me, doing a lot of like leadership trainings, doing a lot of health programs back in the Philippines, it has been very difficult. And this is because they have experienced consistently this othering from those from the mainstream, ethnicities. And it takes a lot to communicate or to show authenticity. Yes, because this is something that has been deeply ingrained. So decolonizing, you know, this processes of organizing, say even from the government back in the Philippines, because they sort of insist on a standard way of organizing and a standard way of approaching the communities. It's really very top down. Even to this day, it's very, very top down. It doesn't really open up spaces for listening to the concerns of the communities. And you know, even with the current pandemic, it's really showing itself in very ugly ways. Yeah, so that's one. And the other way, the other key register that I can think of is, you know, like when my multiple, I would think of myself like, and this was mentioned by the other panelists, of going back into the field as something that is a process that I myself feel conflicted about. Sometimes I feel like I'm also, you know, I'm in a neo-liberal university, and like going back to the communities, I sometimes feel like I'm feeling like a hoax, you know, that you're going there, you're an outsider, and you are doing research, field research in a community. And it takes, like I mentioned earlier, it takes a lot to articulate your solidarity with the community. And this is, like I said, it's a community that I have worked with for almost 2 decades. I have a foster family there. I just before the pandemic, I was there to bring the results of a research. And to the other people who do not know me, or those who are meeting me for the first time, I always take the identity of the mainstream. I always take the identity of those people who look down on them. And in my field work, I would always experience this, like when I was doing my field work way back in 2013, and it persists. When I talk to them, I become the representative of the lowlanders, they call us, yeah, and they call us. So to my face, like they would say, "You Tagalogs, you discriminate us, you do this and that," and it takes a lot of I would say commitment to continue doing that kind of work, and it also takes a toll on those organizers or researchers who would genuinely want to build authentic relationships with the community. And so I digressed a little bit about that. So what I was saying, when they talk to me, for example, they would not be very trusting, and that I said is understandable. Now, on the from the perspective of those who organize, for example, it makes it difficult to bring in projects who are well-meaning, okay, which are well-meaning. But at the same time, because a lot of this, like the government projects, for example, they do not listen to the processes of the communities. They just insist on the processes that they want to implement in the community. So here we have projects being seen as something to be implemented, and the communities have built sort of a form of a resistance, even that, okay, they will just take it. Okay, you have this project, and we will take it because we can get something out of it. But after that project is done, it's over. Yeah, so that is, I think, a form of a subtle form of resistance, I would say, but it's very useful. Like if you look at it from a standpoint where you want to improve on a specific project, for example. Am I still okay with the time, Prof. Mohan?
Yes, you're okay.
Yeah. So now a little bit on my work in Singapore, because I'm also working with foreign domestic workers here, along with Prof. Mohan when he was still here, and with Satbir and Dia, who are also now present in this session. So it took a different angle. Yeah. So there are a lot of indigenous foreign domestic workers here in Singapore from the same community that I did a lot of work where my fieldwork was on, and they would share how it's also the same, like even while they are here in Singapore, the experience is the same. Yeah. And for me, of course, like because I would say, well, not really a minority, not myself, because of course I am in a position of privilege, I would say, being educated here and teaching here. But interacting with the foreign domestic workers, it also persists, like organizing projects with them, or even just sessions or interviewing them. You would feel like like it's the power, the power between the one who is interviewing, like myself, or the power that they are holding, or they feel that they are not holding, is very evident even with this activities or this like engagements that we have with them. Yeah, so I think I'll just stop there, Prof. Mohan.
Thank you so much, Dazzy. Let's move on to the next prompt, which is, what are the key threads of decolonizing methods that emerge from organizing in the global South? Yeah. Is that okay, or do you want someone else to start?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine.
Great. We are going to start with Mary.
I'm just reading my notes. Is it on? Okay, right. So what are the key threads of decolonizing methods that emerge? So my notes for this were actually really short, because for me, research is relational. And as soon as you move into the relational space, the threads for decolonizing become apparent. In that, I'll give you an example. Alison Jones talked about this indigene. I'm not too fussed about the terms, but we're going to use them because they're hers. Indigene colonizer relationship, and she talked about working the hyphen in a relationship. So you've got me as a Pākehā researcher working with Maori. So there's a hyphen, Pākehā Maori relationship. So she talks about working the hyphen. It's not about being exclusively one or exclusively the other. It's honouring what you bring to the table, but working at it. It might be unsettling, it might be challenging. In fact, there's no might about it. It can be, it is. And Pihama talks about making the Maori Pākehā research relationship respaced. And I really liked that, because when as a Pākehā, you can be dominant without even realising it. I mean, one only has to look at media to see what faces are on standard mainstream TV. But so it's about leaving space, stepping back, leaving the space open to be filled by Maori researchers, their worldviews, Maori worldviews, and therefore decentering this taken for granted notion or what research practice in New Zealand should look like. And I use that purposefully, because when you talk about research in Aotearoa New Zealand, you're honouring tangata whenua and everything that Māori has and brings to the table. When talking about just New Zealand, you automatically cut them out. And I can use them there because of where I am, blah, blah. Anyway, so if we go back to kaupapa Māori research, this is the one that it's in parallel with what I do. It's the strategy to achieve 3 central political objectives for Māori. That is to retain tino rangatiratanga, it's to be politically seen and heard, and to maintain cultural identity and distinctiveness. So that whole process, kaupapa Māori research, is a way to operationalise the self-determination. This is according to Bishop, and I support that. So it's about centering, it calls for research centred within Te Ao Māori. And as a Pākehā, I know of Te Ao Māori. I know some of the languages, the stories, the terminology, the concepts, but I am not of Te Ao Māori. Therefore, I must step back and leave spaces for Māori to talk for themselves. They don't need it for me. So the four key, and this approach challenges and questions and critiques Pākehā hegemony. So that's Pihama, and I agree with that. So 4 values central to this whanaungatanga, that means relationships, taonga toku iho, which is about honouring the knowledge that has come down from the past to the people here now, and tino rangatiratanga. So that's one aspect. The other idea for the threads is this whole notion of respacing. And Barclay talks about and he's talking about biculturalism, but I think that it can still apply. The concept, the metaphors can still apply, and that's the heartland of biculturalism is about inclusion, honouring each other. They're all bog standard, nice things to have, but he questions it and says, well, what about we have a beach metaphor instead? Now, given that in Aotearoa, New Zealand, heartland, you can have the Heartland Bank, you can have Heartland Stories. It's all about, mostly Pākehā New Zealand, but there's also Maori is the heartland. But then you've got beaches. Beaches are really fundamental to the way of life in this little country. going there, going to the beach is critical. Experiencing the water and the sand is critical. So these two metaphors, the heartland and the beach, are really, really helpful. So Barclay suggests moving that for real relationships to occur, to be, and I would say worked at that hyphen, we need to move away from the heartland and go to the space of the beach, where there's an in-between space that can be politicized, inhabited, and constituted, by contestation, disruption, and contingency, as well as stability. So, because the water is always coming in, the beach is always changing, and it has to be renegotiated. Nothing can be taken for granted, and nothing can be prescribed. And this is the tricky ground that Linda Tahiwai Smith talks about. It's less certain, but it's no less real, and nothing can be taken for granted. So that's why I like that. And I could actually talk about the 3 Ps and how to operationalize those in research, but I might keep that for the last question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Debashish.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. I think there's a lot to pick up from what you said, and going back to response to the first prompt as well. I mean, the notion of the global South, and you said that you wanted to understand what that was, and it's a very, very good question, I think, because I think we also in some ways need to problematize the whole the notion of the global South. And that's important too, because I think, and as you said, you used it as a metaphor, and I think most of us do, because geographically it probably doesn't make sense. Although at one time, I think it was a geographical term, because sociologists, used the term South to denote the areas that were southernmost to the the axis of power, so to say. And so that's where the marginalization began. And of course, it was followed up by Gramsci raising the question of the Southern question, which is basically the, oppression or colonizing, so to speak, of Northern Italy over Southern Italy, really. So I think the geographical thing had a place, but it's definitely metaphorical now, because you find New Zealand, of course, is in the south geographically, and so is Australia. But in so many ways, the core of both these countries is situated in the north, so to speak. I mean, aligned with the former colonial powers. But there is a south that exists within the south and in the north as well. Like you have the Native Canadian and Native American communities in the geographical north, who are pretty much the south, and the Aboriginal communities in Australia, and even Maori in New Zealand. So I think looking at the notion of the global south is important too, and understand where it's coming from. And you mentioned Linda Tahiwai Smith, and I've had the privilege of working with her, and in fact, Decolonizing Methodologies is definitely one of my go-to texts for that, where along with other anti-colonial scholars before her, like Ngugi Thiong'o and Fanon and Edward Said, she challenges the claim of Western modes of research to be universal and for the greater good for everyone, when it's actually not. Ultimately, these dominant methods have been reified in universities around the world. And as one of us said, that we all seem to be working in these universities. And these universities, the structures are such that they maintain the power imbalance between the elite and marginalized communities. And so it's actually for us to resist those. And it is a challenge, because we are all part of these kinds of establishments and structures, and no matter how well-meaning we might be, we all fall into the trap of, the same kind of stuff. And if only we could get out of all of that and not worry about any publication or grants or anything, that we might be able to do a lot more meaningful work. But those are the kind of, as they say, we are hamstrung by that. You also mentioned, the Treaty of Waitangi, and I think talking about the South, how can we use the question was, what are the key threads of decolonizing methods that emerge from organizing in the global South? And so if we take Aotearoa, New Zealand, for instance, as the look at the methods of the South within this country, for instance, so there's a lot that we can learn from there. And just as what you said about Treaty of Waitangi, the 3 P's of partnership, participation, and protection. I think these are, as I see it, these are fundamental values, really. I mean, these emerge from the global South, of course. I mean, the South within the geographical South here. But these are really individual values which should be part of our research processes in any case, I think. And so that's something that definitely emerges from here. And also you've mentioned many of the Kaupapa Maori principles, for instance, and there are many of them. Tino Ranga, Tiratanga, the principle of self-determination is, of course, primary in terms of communities trying to exercise their own identities and own, sovereignty as well, actually. So all that does come from here. Now, in my work, earlier work, for instance, I've got a lot of insights from work that has been done in what at one time used to be called the third world communities. But there too now, what we're seeing is, and going back to the whole question of the South, for instance, not only is there a South in the geographical North, but there is actually a North within the geographical South as well, and which is making things a lot more complex. So, for instance, if you take the country of my birth, India, for instance, where many of our today's participants are from, yesterday's and today's, you definitely find that although it is in the South in some word, and there's lots to learn from the methods of communities that are, working, let's say, in Bundelkhand or Vidarbha, as Ashwini was talking about in the last session. But there are also pockets, elite pockets of, within those countries, which is what gets taught in the business schools and other schools in the Indian context as well. So we are up against that challenge as well to resist those pressures. And of course, because there's money, power of, politics and business all intertwined there, you have the Adanis and the Ambanis all, patched up with the politicians. And they not only own the media, as somebody else was saying, but big businesses and increasingly universities as well. And so, it's a really difficult situation there. But of course, there are people in the marginalized communities who are working a lot, and we have a lot to learn from them. A book that I co-edited a couple of years ago, Feminist Futures, it had so many examples of people, working, let's say, from women's access to safe abortion in Kenya, because they were up against anti-abortion discourses fueled by cultural and religious discourses within that country. So it's not so much a colonial imposition, but even from within that country. And then we had autoethnographic studies from El Salvador, talking about guerrilla warfare and revolution. And then in our work on Climate Futures, which is a fairly recent book, we document, the struggles of subaltern communities in designing climate action strategies in frontline states of Bangladesh, the Maldives, and the Pacific Islands in our neighborhood. So there's a lot to learn from them, but increasingly in the last few years, I've learned enormously from working in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the two, very briefly, I'll talk about two projects that have been involved in, mainly on the one in the climate change space and the other in the genetic modification space. And in both cases, we find that some dominant perspectives still, rule the way decisions are made. So for instance, in the climate change space, you have scientists, who are working on climate modeling, etc. And they do fantastic work. I'm not in any way trying to undermine what they're doing, but ultimately, they feel that the results or the findings that they have apply to everybody regardless of their context, and that is not true, which is what we found going into some of the really impoverished communities, including Maori communities, for instance, where their needs are different from what the modelers might project. So you might say, for instance, the modeling shows that 5 years from now you should move away from this locality. But it's not enough to just go to the community and say that you move away from there when they've, for generations they've lived there. So unless you have a solution, a viable solution to shift them somewhere else, there's no point, coming up with the science and saying that, this will be inundated in 5 years, and so you move away from there. So, and simple things like, for instance, near in the North Island, for instance, near Waitomo, there is a marae that is already being submerged in high tide, for instance. And so the question is, how do you take bodies of people who've passed away, to the marae for the last rites when the tide is high and you cannot go in there, for instance. And that's an immediate cultural, spiritual, whatever need. And for people to not look at those issues as primary issues is a problem, really. So there's a lot that we have learned from some of the methods in the South, especially in some of the Kaupapa Maori principles of care and guardianship and all of that. So I think being reflective, also self-reflexive, I think as researchers, we can imbibe a lot of things that are actually happening in the frontline communities and see if we can incorporate that in our research, sometimes in resistance, or as I like to use the word insurgent, being insurgent academics, which go against the dominant scholarship, really, when it does not meet the needs of the local communities. Yeah, I'll probably stop there for the moment.
There's so much. There's so much to process there, especially in the idea of insurgent academics.
Yeah.
And Dazzy, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So the key threads of decolonizing methods, I feel, that emerge from organizing the global South. I would discuss three interrelated ones. So first, I feel, is reflexivity, and that was already mentioned earlier, actually. The other is appreciating or recognizing the appreciating non-generalizability of the global South. And then, and for my own field work, authenticity will have, or will come, will face you. It will have very different faces. I mean, it will have a different looks. I remember during my dissertation defense back in 2015, there was one member of the panel who asked whether, he was very critical to my work, and he asked, how are you able to generalize this? How are you able to generalize the results? How will this be useful? And will this, emphasizing that for my research to be useful, it has to be generalizable to other indigenous communities in the world. And, as somebody who, and I think I have imbibed this feeling of being the colonial subject. When I am in that space, I just feel like I'm so afraid. I think I'm going to say something wrong. And in the presence of this, a very established scholar studying the subject that I'm working on, it really, it took a lot of courage for me to stand up and really assert why really the thing is, you cannot generalize it. Even with, if I may share with you just this, it's a image, and can you see it? Yeah, so this is just my field notes in photos. This is in just one of the 3 communities that I was in Mountain Province, Philippines. And, you know, I answered that question by saying, I cannot even generalize the 3 indigenous communities, and they are all labeled and lumped under this label Igorot. And I cannot generalize it, except for, of course, there are commonalities in the experiences, as with the experiences of marginalized communities, I suppose, across the world. But to generalize them and say that all their experiences are the same, I think is doing them, doing the struggles, and as well as the beauty of the community, what they have gone through, what they're going through, what they are attempting to do to better their lives. It's doing them a disservice, I feel. So I think that is one of the to me, at the least, a key thread of decolonizing this methodology. I understand though, like even when I can't remember who I was speaking, who I was speaking to about, like, so can you really talk about the global South? Is there can you qualify it? And even that label is problematic, and Prof. Debashish already mentioned it just now, right? Even in the South, there is, we have the North, and even in the North, you have those marginal, the South, and precisely that. I think one of the beauties of decolonizing, or appreciating that you can decolonize your approaches, not just to research, but your approach to organizing, is very important in the work that we do. So the other point that I wanted to make is, authenticity will have very different faces. It will have different looks, and it's tied intimately with the concept of with the practice, not just the concept, the practice of reflexivity. Like in all 3 communities, I would do things like differently. Like in this first community where I did the longest, where I have spent the longest time, of my work with them, almost 2 decades, it was easier for me to really going to talk to people, and really just build that relationship further. But with the other 2 communities, it was different. Like here, you'd see me, whatever I can provide them, they would want, usually when I go there, they would want trainings, the teachers would want, to learn of, so what are the other methods that can be applied, and other things like that. So it would have different looks, really. It can be as simple as, being a judge in a beauty pageant in the school. Yeah, we are big fans of that. So different looks, and to me, I do not have an easy answer to the question. So what can you do? Is there a specific way to approach the community, except to really make sure that it is centered on the needs of the community? And that's why I'm a big fan of, and not to be a fangirl of my own supervisor, Prof. Mohan, but really when I started, I was really lost with what methods I can use, and I've been, and this is the thing with getting a PhD in universities, right? Like I've experienced being told that you have to be objective. And that's why I echo what Rahul was talking about earlier. You have to acknowledge your subjectivity. It's the most important thing. And it's, I think I even believe that it's one of your tools, most important tools, when you go and if you are truly committed doing work in the Global South, okay? And I'm just saying the Global South like as a collective, because I know if we want to go to get anywhere into asserting what needs to be changed in the scholarship, we have to call it something, right? We call it the marginalized communities, the subaltern, and of course, I recognize that there are, delineations amongst those terms. But what I'm trying to say is, this subjectivity, the recognition that this subjectivity exists and that it is actually an effective tool that we can use, is very important when thinking about methods, okay, decolonizing methods in whichever global South community you are doing your work in. That's it for me, Prof. Mohan.
Kia ora, Dazzy. Thank you so much. And the admiration is mutual. I admire your courage and your ability to stand up and say that generalization might not be the purpose of the work that I'm doing within this context. I think that takes a lot of courage to say that. Rahul, shall we go to you and then to you, Zhou?
Certainly. So I'll try and keep this a little short, because several of my points have already been made by other panelists, and I'm delighted that's the case. So when I'm looking at the question, what are the key threads of decolonizing methods that emerge from organizing in the global South? I want to understand this question as one of the operating words to be emerging, the emerging of something while we engage with and study global South simultaneously. And one of the things that I want to kind of talk about is another of the central tenets of scholarship that continues to be mired in registers of whiteness. That is this idea of purity, this idea of homogeneity, this idea of purity, as Professor Munshi was saying, and several of us have now mentioned. There is a North in the global South, and there is a South in the global North, and much too often, scholarship has this impetus to just look away from what doesn't really sort of fill in, what doesn't really neatly fit into its own agendas of upward, not social, but upward academic mobility, if we may put it that way. And when I'm talking about everyday practices of local organizing, and I'm talking about spaces where farmers, come together and talk about how they're experiencing their experiences of distress, stigma, silencing, do offer them a space to articulate things, and that itself sort of counteracts a lot of neoliberal enemy that is produced in the rural lands in India. But at the same time, I also recognize that each of these everyday moments of organizing and social change and resistance are laced with their own kind of, they are not completely homogeneous or unproblematic. Each of these are laced with their own problems and their own kind of sub-hegemonies, if I may put it that way. But because there is a certain everydayness to these acts or instances of organizing, I think we should eschew from another sort of a high tome of research, which we refer to as reductionism. Because organizing happens in the everyday, we should not approach it from the point of view of reductionism. And this should also prompt us not to envisage on crafting scholarship that drafts ultimate truth or ultimate truths about social life in any given context. And as he was very rightly referring to that, with this idea of how ludicrous even the idea of generalizability sort of looks like in this particular space, because you're imagining that there has to be some universal truth for it to kind of for one's work to make sense or be valid or so on. And just like us researchers are kind of embroiled in reproducing privilege while we document and counteract it. Real world organizing in Global South is also has several sides to it, and the North within the Global South is not necessarily an aberration. It's there, and we have to understand, recognize, and sort of address it instead of trying to just look away and keep producing scholarship that sort of panders to these ideas of romanticism and purity and this idea that these movements of the Global South are just almost divine events that are happening under the inhuman influence of capitalism and so on and so forth. So writing about organizing or writing about this organizing then also becomes an act of politics and becomes inextricably linked with an impetus that the researcher also embodies. The researcher embodies his research and what he's saying, he or she is saying. Here, we discover that the separation of the researcher, researched, and research is shaken. It's problematized. It's almost, if I may say, dismantled. And the findings that emerge, and now I'm referring to that operative word that I was focusing on in the question. The findings that emerge don't merely arise from the data; they also come from the researcher's positionality, researcher's politics, how he or she sees the field, how their agendas impact what they see, what they find, what they gather, and what they look at, what they consider important. And this is something that is important. Like this the findings that emerge don't merely come from the data; they also come from the researcher's positionality, and this throws into sharp relief so much of work that is done in ignorance of its own position. I feel we need to take this moment to not just say that positionality is important. We actually need to take a step further and say that personality perhaps is indispensable, and people or research that does not acknowledge that is actually falling short. It's actually dishonest scholarship. This throws in relief so much of work that is done in ignorance of its own position and its own role in the larger structures of politics, economics, academic upward mobility, if you may. And this ignorance is strategic, I argue. This is not a happenstance. This ignorance is absolutely strategic. And it's strategic because once you don't acknowledge, or once you create a system of knowledge that doesn't require you to draft your draft your own privileges or your own positionalities, it automatically obviates how your research is actually furthering privileges and how it sort of adds to structures of exploitation, colonization, and so on and so forth. And this is something important that I want to share. And I want to, remember Walter Benjamin, even though I'm not quoting directly from what he said, but when he said that, each document of civilization is also a document of barbarity. Just like that, each description of positionality is also a testament of the dishonesty of the work that does not acknowledge its own positionality. I think we have to take that stance. This is not something that we do because we are large-hearted or so on. This is something that is indispensable to social research. How is it that that folks or research does not engage in this I find central idea that not only undergirds, but that really puts wheels into motion of any kind of social of any kind of social research. So in place of, so coming back to the idea of purity, in place of trying to create perfect recipes of analyzing and presenting data, again, to what this sort of relates to what Dazzy was saying earlier, like in place of our research, think of our research to create perfect recipes of analyzing and presenting data. We need to recognize that data presentation itself is political, and it's always embodied, and it's always contextualized. And no matter how much one wants to disavow these aspects of their scholarship, it is always already present, in the sense of pure ideology in a very kind of sense. It's always already present, your own positionality. And in that, we need to present our data without making it bereft of its own complexities, its own heterogeneities, its own cultural rationalities. Through our entire long-term body of work, we cannot say that we will just not look at the problematic sides of any social situation. We cannot say that we will not look at the fact that the farmer protests that are happening in India are protests by landed farmers, and being a landed farmer in India itself is a position of privilege. So even as we document that protest and stand in solidarity with that protest and really do everything to encourage that protest, we also will have to acknowledge that there is something else happening here as well. And we perhaps need to exalt the good that is being done, or exalt the progressive that is being done here, while also exhorting the same social organizing for addressing the problematic sides to it. And this is where I find culture-centered work to be very honest and very upfront and very very true to itself. So in addition to exalting what is progressive in movements of the global South, we need to also exhort the same movements to perhaps rectify what is the problematic of the very same kind of an organizing act. And here then we stop the exoticizing and the romanticizing of social change movements in the global South. There's this huge a narrative and discourse that loves to just understand movements in the global South as these pure entities that are exotic, that are romantic, that are just happening. And we have to, we also have to respond to that and take a different road. And here we stop the exoticizing and romanticizing of social change movements in the global South, which is also a manifestation of multicultural whiteness and tropes of multiculturalism in the larger structure and registers of whiteness. So I'll stop my response to the second question here.
Thank you. Over to Zhou. Your turn now to address the question.
Thank you. I don't know how we're doing in terms of time. I kind of, my answer to the second and the third question are kind of related. So because I'm the last person to answer the second question, maybe am I right? So maybe I can kind of segue and connect my responses to the two to somehow help.
So maybe Mohan has just stepped out for a little while. He'll be back very soon. But maybe if you could start the response to the third prompt. Yes. How do methods from the global South dismantle the registers of disciplinary whiteness? Thank you for taking the lead on that one, Gio.
Certainly, I feel that these two questions are connected, and I find those are tough questions to answer. And my reason is this: I feel that decolonization, I always consider that as a student of the colonization knowledge process. So we learn the troops, we learn the method, we adopt and learn the methods through the masters, right? And at the same time, we know there are many different names and new avatars of the colonization process. We call that the global, global neoliberal process. We call it in the neoliberal globalization. We call it the new kind of global intervention, so on and so forth. And those new avatars of the colonizing project inevitably learns, and they're very surreptitious and promiscuous in learning the ways of decolonization methods. So what happens is that as critical scholars, critical post-colonial scholars develop methods, inevitably you see the cooptation and the adoption of methods. I remember, Mohan's not here, but I remember when CCA was a method like developed to specifically target at subordinate populations. Inevitably, there will be management communication scholars. There will be specifically neoliberal kind of oriented scholars who are really interested in adopting that approach and learning the methods. So in looking at this, I think it's not about specific methods and specific methodologies, but I think is the tricks is in the process of how certain methods are emerge and how certain methods are applied in specific research situations. And of course, there are most methods that fundamentally have more of subversive decolonizing teeth, that I call them. For example, the methods of disruption, the methods of disorganization in organization studies, studying and normalizing the tensions, the inconsistencies in organizations, and really centering and be more sensitive towards those aspects, I feel has been more productive in producing research studies that have more kind of decolonizing potential. I'm interested recently in the methods of the aesthetics, of arts, of performance, and looking at how learning from the old masters, the colonial movement, if you look at Orientalism, how arts and aesthetics being used, the seductive power of art. It is, I see that used more often in critical scholarship, in critical performance. I don't know, we are expanding the understanding of scholarship. So like, for example, the recent projects Mohan has been working with, documenting the art of indigenous people. I remember I was very impressed by the moment where the Banksy art was shredded at the moment at the auction hall, and I see how that has been it's such a remarkable kind of anti-neoliberal moment, and it has so much intellectual depth to it. The other method that I think is I'm more interested in, and I feel has a lot of potential, is the methods of self. Of course, I hear a lot of you talk about using reflexivity and also researcher praxis as a tool to fundamentally decolonize the field. Now, coming down to the second part of the answer, looking at how these methods dismantle the register of the disciplinary whiteness. Actually, I'm more interested in looking at how they dismantle the whiteness in knowledge. So of course, when we're looking at the disciplinary whiteness, I think I talked a little bit more about institutions earlier in my answer to the first question. So actually, I'm more here. I want to focus more on the idea of whiteness in knowledge, and I think this is important because whiteness, again, it has the power to transform. It has the power to adopt methods critical methods for its own use. So very often we see the participatory methods being co-opted. We see the methods of participants, indigenous participants being co-opted. We see a lot of actually research results, studies are adopted and reframed into the broader neoliberal framework. That's why I feel one thing that the decolonization or the methods we learn from the global south is actually by looking specifically at the knowledge creation process rather than what knowledge has been created or specific fixed way that knowledge is being processed. I feel that there are things to focus on, like how decolonizing scholars have been working on the locus of knowledge, have been shifting the locus of knowledge, but not only that, by looking at how scholars look at who are recognized as the creator of knowledge, but not only that, we're looking at how the teleology of knowledge, what knowledge fundamentally serve, what population does it serve, but not only that, what counts as knowledge, and what doesn't count as knowledge. But of course, that not only that, in my recent study, looking at subaltern organization and its knowledge creation process, I've realized that knowledge itself is as important as the knowledge creation process. And I feel that means knowledge should be studied at the same time, or the politics of knowledge should be studied at the same time as organizing process, meaning that we're fundamentally looking at how subaltern organizing takes place as knowledge is created, and how, as knowledge is created, it kind of feeds back to, or it participates in the organizing process, or it fundamentally shapes the processes and the structures of subaltern organizing. And in my recent analysis of some of the self-employed women's work in India, I found that to do that, the knowledge process has to focus on a number of things, the dialectics of it, meaning always knowing that and building an organization that recognizes dialectics, focusing on the connections between different and building solidarities through ideological identification, of course, but the knowledge process that works on empowerment, and the knowledge process, I feel, that works on subversion. And I think this is a concept that I really find important, in a sense that decolonization and all the study or all the knowledge process in the global south may not just be creating a different set of knowledge, but in providing a subversive reframing of the knowledge that exists there. And I find in my field research, in my field study, that for example, management knowledge has been used so subversively by women who by self-employed women who want to register for a bank, for example. I don't want to go into details about that. I can talk for hours. But then talking about the subversive nature of knowledge, I want to look at, besides looking at the field research in the target population, I've seen the subversive knowledge potential in a number of fields and subfields in communication that I think we should pay more attention to. These include the critical management communication studies, the study of critical engagement with corporate social responsibility and the neoliberal discourse of corporate social responsibility and how to turn itself around to make that to create a disruptive kind of space. The study of environmental communication, which I see a lot of potential of reframing that into an anti-colonial, decolonizing kind of research projects. And finally, to connect that with more current, like broader political environment we are in, I find more and more the importance of looking at criticism of militant nationalistic discourses, as nationalistic discourses has very often been like cited, being used as the opposite side of colonization discourses, but more often as a scholar who's doing research in China and looking at situation in India and looking at situation in the US and Middle East, I find that it's more important to look at the connection or the kind of oneness of nationalistic as nationalistic kind of as a social movement or the social process together with the neo-colonial social processes. Thank you. That's a lot.
Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah, I like the way you talked about decolonizing as a subversive, actually, and that kind of ties in with my own views of the insurgent academic, really. Thank you. Now, to respond to the third question, Mary?
Oh, to me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm going to be very, I won't talk just yet, I'll wait until, I'm going to be very short and very sweet, hopefully, because I don't know about you, but I'm pretty much overwhelmed by the end of the day. So how do methods of the Global South dismantle registers of disciplinary whiteness? Well, I'm on the inside, you know. So I've come down to, I had a conversation with one of our advisory group members at the end of our second major project. Our advisory group members were from Ministry of Health, social welfare, social development, community groups. They had levels of expertise, and of course they were all Maori. And we also had a cultural group, which was all Kaumātua, because we were working with older Maori to start with. And the organisation we were working with was the Awa Kaumātua Charitable Trust. So at the end of the dinner, the lunch, where we've told people what we learned or what was learned from all the people who were involved, he made the comment that he was really interested in why the research was so positive, was a positive experience for all those who took part, a positive experience for the community group members, and a positive experience for the researchers. And my answer to that was that everyone around that table, no matter how old they were, how much experience they had with research, but more importantly, how much experience they'd had in life, everyone was valued for the contribution they brought to that 2.5-3 year project. So I returned to this idea from McFarlane and co, who talk about what's called a braided rivers approach, that harnessing the energy of different systems, different cultural groups, different people who are in the room, different systems of understanding can be used to create new knowledge that can be used then to advance the understandings of both worlds. So I really like that. So braided rivers approach begins by us, meaning for me as a Pākehā researcher, challenging my own practice and listening to culture. And but that means I want to go back to something that someone said earlier today. I think it was in the previous session, about learning, co-learning and relearning. And I think for me, the last 10 years of working with the Awa and my colleagues at the university has been a process of learning and co-learning and learning together as we move forward. So I think I'm not going to talk about the 3 Ps and how we enact them in each part of the research process, but I just want to say that as a Pākehā researcher, I never work without a community-driven project from the beginning, and then we have to work out how we're going to work together before we actually do the mahi or the work, and then we work it out all along the way. We keep monitoring how we're working and who we're working with. So I'll leave that as a short and sweet finishing statement for how methods can contribute to dismantling registers of disciplinary whiteness.
Thank you, Mary. Now, finally to Rahul, you have a response to the third prompt. How do methods from the Global South dismantle the registers of disciplinary whiteness?
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Munshi. Just like I was mentioning, that this idea of there has, again, I'm speaking in the context of rural India and organizing as for social change in the Global South, and then I'm going to connect it to a larger general argument about method. Just like purity is a fundamental trope or a fundamental kernel idea of colonial discourses or colonizing discourses, so is the savior complex, right? The idea that knowledge from the West is going to go and save people, and very much, and this idea is, as Zhou was also referring to earlier, it's very much alive and kicking in the context of India. But the savior complex today translates in India into converting rural spaces as sites of intervention by the proximate elite. So the center, or the urban center, doesn't really act as a savior, but tries to fashion an imaginary. And I'm borrowing this term from Ashwini in the earlier session, when she was talking about how rural imaginary or how urban imaginaries function and conceive of the rural space. The urban imaginary fashions the rural space as a space in need of intervention and in need of perpetual intervention, if I may. So the urban center, urban center creates its other in the form of rural backwardness, and the rural backwardness is supposed to be the foil to the urban techno gadgetry claims to modernization or modernity, and while using this divide, the urban center hopes that it will continue to embody its privilege, and it will qualify as the favored child of the ultimate systems of power, which is the global north. So the global north has kind of like the urban center in India sort of understand itself as a satellite north, if I may put it that way, to create the rural south and create that kind of disparity, while all this while reinforcing itself that it is actually very modern, and it's just stuck in this place of this backward, surrounded by this backwardness and superstition, and it's just stuck in this place. So by virtue of being an urban citizen, I'm already I'm out of place. I should be in the global north or the ultimate space of power, but I'm just stuck here because of whatever. And I watch Netflix on my 5G phone, and that's my claim to the affiliation to my global north. So here we need to underscore two things, and these two things relate specifically to this space, the urban-rural space in India. We need to understand we need to centrally underscore the unsuitability of this modernist imagination in that is aimed towards uplifting the countryside. We have to recognize that this modernistic imagination is fundamentally flawed as it is applied. For instance, in the form of the complicated structure of mechanized farming, commercial banking structures, fertilizers, and fertilizers, which eventually creates very elaborate migration patterns in rural population and creates things like farmer suicides. We don't need to recognize these created problems as aberrations in a larger sanitized project of modernization. We have to understand them as fundamentally problematic as they are viewed and foisted on, viewed with respect to and foisted upon the rural South, if we may put it that way. Next, we also need to look at, and I'm responding again to the savior complex idea in the white registers of colonization. We need to look at how, at what the field itself, what the rural space itself, in this example, is doing to change itself, to sort of get rid of its own problems. How is it adapting and creating its own agency, which is very endemic, very locally centric. So, for instance, in my work, I document how farmers come together and pool money and get heavy machinery to actually construct small ponds on each farmer's land, so that they're not dependent on this non-functioning neoliberal apparatus of dams and canals that are supposed to give them water, and they can harvest their own water and be more self-sustaining and so on and so forth. And we also need to say that as the local South or the Indian rural space tries to grapple with its problems and tries to address and solve its problems, that is also not unproblematic, and that also creates its own hegemonies, its own global norths, small norths within the South, while at the same time also say that there are actually also things that are very worthwhile in technological interventions or modernistic technologies that can actually potentially be beneficial. And here I am talking and referring to things like importing a processing machinery and starting things like a cooperative, very much in line with like the Mondragon cooperatives that people in the rural sites do. So at the end of the day, we have to keep on. I think it's more of a personal impetus. I think at this point we have to keep on realizing that as we are talking about organizing in the global South, we have to keep on disrupting this idea that the rural space is necessarily backward. It's necessarily always in need of intervention. I'm sorry, are you raising your hand? I can't hear you.
No, I've just been told that there's going to be another session, and so I'm really sorry to interrupt. But so maybe if you take a minute or so to wrap up.
Sure. All right. And in recognizing the impurity of these processes and the disparities here, we contribute to render impure the several processes and several, or dare I say all, these imagined positions of salvation, saviorism that are embedded in their respective grand narratives that registers of whiteness keep on reproducing in different forms. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure we were enjoying listening to you, but I was told there's going to be another session in a few minutes. So
right.
I'm really sorry to have cut short. Dazzelyn, I'm sorry, neither you nor I have a lot of time to respond, but maybe whatever, if you take a couple of minutes to respond to that question, please. And again, I'm sorry, my hands are tied. I believe, yeah, I've been told to wrap up.
Oh, no worries. Actually, like I echo what Zhou mentioned earlier, that the second and the third question are interrelated. So in my case, I also feel also how the last prompt is how do method from the Global South dismantle the registers of disciplinary whiteness. And like I said, whiteness is something that, you know, it doesn't, it's not the language that is being used, at least in the Philippines. Whiteness translates to dominant ethnicity for us back home. So I think how it's also shaking up this structures would still be, you know, how this recognizing this non-generalizability, the authenticity and reflexivity that I discussed earlier, is very much the methods that somehow contributes to freeing up spaces for such voices, these marginalized voices, to be raised up and to float and to be to have you know, the space and the space for it. So I'm trying to rush my thoughts here. So I think though that one of the important takeaways also, which I feel has been you know, strengthened by our panel just now, is this issue of co-optation. And I think it works both ways. And it's something that cannot be avoided, I think. Like, for example, I am representative, I would say, like if I am in the Philippines and in the indigenous communities that I work with, I represent the majority. I am a dominant and I am the North in the South. And in a way, when I go into the community, bringing my projects, speaking to teachers who will influence their students as well, I am in a way co-opting. You know, I bring with me the politics that Rahul was mentioning, that, you know, it's not useful to even pretend that you don't bring your own positionality when you are in a specific space. So in a way, I am also guilty. I am schooled in that, you know, the dominant, I am part in a way of that neoliberal whiteness. So even if I do not want it, it's that recognition that I may bring that, you know, that consciousness with me when I am in the field. But it's that consciousness that I feel, to me at least, is empowering. So I also make it a point that I recognize it whenever I speak to the community. And when they tell me, you know, you Tagalogs, you lowlanders, I recognize it, I embrace it. I don't say that, yeah, they are, you know, all lowlanders are bad. No, I recognize it, I say it, I represent it, and I acknowledge that I once, before, you know, before my mind was more open to these conversations, I also, because I was schooled in that way, I embodied it before. But it's a way of showing your solidarity with the community, that if my way of thinking can change, and I want you know, the community to see the authenticity that I bring with me, it means that, you know, the communities, the methods of the Global South, if you may, can also co-opt these structures. But in a way also, and I've been seeing this, you know, the methods of participant-centered, culture-centered approaches, they are also being penetrated or being used by what Zhou mentioned earlier with you know, this management students, for example, and they're bringing it into their businesses. They're also using it as a method to somehow find out what this community is, how they can target these communities. That is also you know, an inherent danger to it. But I feel it is something that needs to be recognized, but we should all also recognize as well that it cannot be helped. And with recognizing that, we can also think of ways in which that co-optation will benefit more those marginalized communities and not the other way around.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's really the critical point is the solidarity with the community. Quite right. situating yourself as a researcher and bringing your positionality is definitely fundamental to this. We have run out of time, but I'll just quickly end by saying that subaltern communities in different parts of the world are indeed working on decolonizing organizing practices, and so it is good, and resisting neocolonial structures powered by the logics of capitalism. So it is happening, and so and eventually I think the registers of disciplinary whiteness will disappear. At least the process has started, which is good. Methods from the Global South emphasize the post-colonial ethic of accountability, which Maria Gonzalez describes as the ability to account or to tell a story. So it's another way of looking at what accountability is. And so those stories from the South are really important to recognize. And just picking up on your emphasis on the word solidarity, and I think what keeps and will continue to keep the decolonizing project going is the notion of solidarity. There's no question about that. In fact, I like the third world feminist scholar Chandra Talpade Mohanty's conceptualizing of solidarity in terms of mutuality, accountability, and the recognition of common interests as the basis for relationships among diverse communities. Each attempt at decolonizing organizing practices is unique and specific to its own context, and we also have to remember that. The idea is to bind the diverse movements in networks of solidarity, but also make sure that each movement retains its own values, goals, and political aspirations. And this is where my native Canadian colleague, Erica Violet Lee, she very aptly puts it. I want to move through the world in a way that acknowledges Black women as the originators of so much freedom work without reducing our existences as Black and Native women to a harmful and impossible comparative study. So we need to have this solidarity between these or among these communities, but also make sure that the values of each are preserved and protected and respected as well. So in a small way, I mean, I have a new book out on public relations and sustainable citizenship representing the underrepresented, in which my co-author and I document some of these the networks of solidarity and relationship building between and among marginalized communities. But that's more about that in another session, another time. We've definitely run out of time, but it was just so good to listen to all of you, and it's been a huge learning experience for me, and I'm hoping for most of the others as well. I can't thank you enough. I'm really glad to have come down from Hamilton to Palmerston North. And to be able to listen to all of you. So on that note, I'll thank you. And if each one of you want to have a last word or a last sentence, go for it. Is there anything that you want to say? No? Okay, so on that note, I will, do you want to say something, Mary?
Yes, thank you.
Ah, Mary says thank you. So yeah.
As well.
Kiora, bye, and hopefully we'll connect again online or in person at some point, or at least through our writings, if nothing else. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.